Alright everybody, hey, this is Ryan with the Silver Tryhard. So we're going to be doing something a little bit different. Obviously, this is like an actual video. Taken with my phone because I am too, I don't have like a nice camera or anything. I use just webcam usually. So, I've recently spent about a week or two building this. So this looks like just a standard 1-up arcade cabinet that you would get from Walmart. I haven't replaced any of the buttons or anything, but I have replaced the insides with a computer, among other things. So I'm going to kind of go over from start to finish how I did this entire process, starting with modifying the machine itself. So you got some buttons down here, some better speakers, and then going on to how to get MAME set up. I won't be providing a way in which to get ROMs or anything, because that's just not something I'm going to do. You can find ROMs, everyone, look around the internet, you can find them. But I will tell you how to utilize them, at least in MAME, because I have specifically set this up as a MAME machine. But I'll put timestamps in the description of this video to take you around to the different parts if you're only interested in a specific part of the tutorial, but let's start going. So I figured I would start by mentioning this, as I forgot to in the beginning there. So I did this with the least amount of drilling possible. I didn't drill anything. All the holes that exist here were already there. In the case of the buttons and the control sticks, I didn't even replace them. I do have replacement buttons for them and control sticks in case they go bad or anything like that, or I turn out to really hate them, but so far I haven't. But I have not used them except in the case of these two buttons down here. I took the buttons from the set that I bought and placed them there because I figured I didn't have any other buttons to use and I needed 2 extra buttons there. And I'll explain what those are for. But these are the standard. This is the standard layout. I unplugged all of the boards that were already here. So there was one PVC board right up here that went on top of this, and you can unscrew it. These holes here held it down, and I popped that off and chucked it in the trash. So these 2 buttons, which are the on and off switch, and the volume switch, I do not have plugged into anything because I am using a desktop PC for this build. If you're using a Raspberry Pi, there are tutorials out there to, at the very least, make it so you can use this on-off switch to turn the Raspberry Pi on and off without having to go behind the machine in any way. And I have actually have my own method for that using the desktop, and we will go over that as well. But starting here, you might see here this yellow bit on these plugs. It's like some kind of wood glue or something. I'm sorry if I'm wrong about any of this. I'm not big on like hardware in terms of like wood and building and things. I'm more of the electronic side. But it made it incredibly difficult to pull some of these out because I had to pull all of the cables for the buttons out of the original board, and some of them were stuck in there so bad that I couldn't get them out of that wood glue. I had to pull the whole plastic casing that it plugged into entirely with it, and then on these, if you have the same problem, you can just pull these off, which I did on the ones that I had to, and then slide you see the 2 little pins in there? You can slide it directly onto those 2 pins and it'll still work just fine. These cables are the cables that were originally on these buttons. The cables on the sticks are not the original cables. If you use the original cables that came with the sticks, at least in my case, I was not able to use the sticks. It would only register right and upright on the stick and would not register anything else. I had to use these cables, same ports though. And then it worked just fine. So I had a little bit of trouble there until I figured that out. I couldn't really find anyone mentioning that specific issue online. So basically, you take, like I said, you take all the same wires, plug them into these, and I'll have a link to these items. I should mention that I followed ETA Prime's video for a lot of this a lot of this build initially, and then just sort of edited it from there to my own devices, my own use. So I bought this off of the link that he had placed, and I will place the same link in the description for everyone. But I wanted to give him some credit because, you know, this isn't 100% for me. But these are a bit newer than the ones that he had in his video because they have a newer model for these, so the layout's slightly different. All of these buttons along all these slots along the top are all buttons 1 through 12, and these on the bottom correspond to different functions like changing the control stick between analog and digital, and a couple other things like turbo, but you know, you'd have to have extra buttons for those, and there are instructions on how to use that. This is for a different type of control stick, and then these are to power LEDs if your button has if your buttons have LEDs. But like I said, in my case, I'm using the original buttons, and they do not have LEDs. So they just use these USB cables, which is just an A to B USB cable that came with it. Comes on down to the computer back there and plugs right into it. So this is all pretty straightforward. You'll see that the speaker is still here, though I am not using it. I was using it at first, which is... Okay, somebody's driving by really loud outside. I was using it at first, which is why the cable is stripped away for being used instead of having the original plug on it. But then I decided I wanted to have stereo sound instead of mono, which is why I have this down here. And that is actually what we will move on to next. So we'll just pan down here. So this control panel, I'm gonna take a seat on the floor here. So this control panel, this wooden panel is just slides right out. So if I were to lift this up, it slides right up and out. I did not, like I said, I didn't do any drilling. So I bought this panel, this replacement panel. And then the place I bought it from, which I will link to as well, lets you just choose to have it come with speakers. The speakers aren't nice, like super nice, but it was $6 for both speakers together, a pair of them, so it was like $3 a speaker. You could get some nicer 4-inch speakers and plug them into the amp, but at this point I don't feel the need for it, and I'll turn the machine on at the very end. You can hear what it sounds like and what I've got set up. But I have mapped these buttons with auto hotkey to do, which is a software, and I will place links to everything that I mentioned software wise as well. This does volume down and this does volume up in steps of 5%, so I keep the amp at a consistent 3/4 of the way up, just so it's not going crazy, and then I just use these to adjust volume, so I don't need to go behind the machine for any purpose. So these are just not screwed in, but the screw is placed through, and there's a bolt on the other side, or a nut that you just screw in to hold it flush against it there, and then the speakers are against that. So that was a super cheap purchase, about 18 bucks for the whole thing together, and then I had to go source the nuts myself with the screws. I got them at Home Depot for $1.80 a pack of them, and it was exactly how many I needed. So that was super easy and super good. So those, I obviously also had to get my own speaker wire, which I will show you here. And I have a wire stripper, which I stripped the wires there, and then I wrapped them on the ends and used electrical tape to hold them on, and then it runs down and plugs into the amp right here, which we will go, let's actually just go back here and look. So we've got the amp back here, and that, like I said, is about 3/4 up at all times. And then this, which I will also link to, is the this is the controller board for the LCD. So if you were starting this from the get-go, this is probably where you'd want to start. This cabling here, there's a box that used to be over that, and you can probably see the holes there where it held itself on. You'll unscrew that and unplug all of the cables that go into the LCD directly, and unplug them, and they go in just like this. So there's a cable there with all of the red cables on the left. This cable here lets you control the LCD in terms of turning it on and off if you want to, or adjusting a couple things. I haven't really used it, but it comes with the kit, so might as well get it hooked up. I don't have it stuck to the back here because the grounding screw right here kind of lifts the back of the board enough that it makes it kind of hard. Wow, people driving like assholes out there. You can probably hear that. But this is an old desktop I had lying around. And it's all I needed for it was a power supply, because I had pulled it out from my new computer, so many years ago. So all I did was slap a new power supply that I purchased into it, and then hooked it all up and got it ready to go. So this has an HDMI out on it. So HDMI goes directly into the graphics card on here and outputs. The power cable for this does not come with the board, but the power cable for your standard 1UP arcade machine will plug perfectly right into this and doesn't need to be adjusted at all. There is a power cable that you will need to purchase for the amp, which I will link to, or there is a set that comes with it. Just be aware that the amp that I purchased, at least, did not have auxiliary output directly on the back of it, and that's just my fault for not looking. But I had to go and buy an RCA to auxiliary converter, and so I could plug it into my computer. And RCA is the red and white cables. Beyond that, we've got I've got a mouse and keyboard back here that I just keep back here in case I need to plug that in and make any specific changes. And then you might see down here I've got this cable running out of the computer. So I plug that into the motherboard, and then that feeds up here, and it is a power button for the machine. This was like $7.50. I almost wanted to get something that would sit a little more flush and maybe drill a hole and have it stick out here, but like I said, I didn't want to drill anything for this process, so this was the easiest way for someone like me to just do it. So it comes with a little sticky thing, so I stuck that on there. Power button turns it on. It's got a reset button if I need it, and the button lights up with LED around it when the computer's on. There's also a hard drive light thing you can do where it'll blink, but I just left the power one and didn't plug in the hard drive light because I didn't need it up here blinking. So I've also wired it up so that, I think as far as, so let's just go over steps really quick. You start with removing the panel here, which I've thrown that away now, and that's the whole thing, more or less, the board, and you want to unplug all of the stuff from that, chuck that in the garbage, plug it into your board that you've purchased, cable there, cable here, and a cable here. But this one doesn't come off of the back here. The only thing that comes off the back is the grounding pin, which mine had a nut because it was grounded on the original board, and this one fit perfectly. This one to control the LCD, and then this one over here. So then you've got the HDMI and the power. You've got the amp that plugs directly into whatever speakers you decide to use. Now, keep in mind you don't necessarily need to use an amp. If you want to just source yourself some super basic computer speakers and plug them in, that's not going to hurt anyone. And you could always stick them to the top of this with something sticky and just have them blast off the top of your machine. There's nothing wrong with that. But I wanted to kind of have it all inside of the machine, more or less, which is why I went this way. So if we pull back around here, then you'll want to do this part, which we already covered, but I'll go over it again really quick. You've got to have, and this is, man, I feel dumb mentioning this out of order, but this is something that you want to make sure you do, at least as far as ETA Prime is concerned, when he mentioned it in his video. I didn't go against it, but I'm assuming it will probably cause an issue if you do. I'm not sure if it will on a desktop, but all of the buttons on here are plugged into the same spots on here. So the top right button over here will be plugged into the same spot on this board as it would on this board for this top right button, if that makes sense. So 1 through 6 are all the same button, and then I've got 7 and on each of them for the player start buttons, which I have just linked in MAME to also be the add coin button, so you can just jam the same button and it starts the game and adds the coin, so I don't need to add an extra selecting coin button to the game. The only game I've had an issue with in that case was Galaga. For some reason it did not like having them on the same button, but that was easy enough because Galaga only uses shoot, so I just mapped one of these other buttons to do it instead. So since I've kind of explained how that goes, And then obviously, like I said, I put these buttons down here. I did not plug them in for LED, even though they are wired for it. And then they just come straight up and into the board here. I unplugged them while I was doing this part of the video. Here they are, because I couldn't really lay it down like this because the cable doesn't go very far. But I will put all this back together, and then we'll turn it on and go over the software and setup portion there. Okay, so we're back and it's all put right back together now. I just screwed these back on. You might notice that I bought the acrylic covering for this because I just wanted it to stay nice and look nice on the top, because I had bought this on OfferUp from some folks that didn't want it anymore, and it was a bit worn away up to about here across the board. But I'm going to start from the beginning here, how the whole thing goes. So like I said, you press this, turns the computer on, the screen will kick in automatically. It'll boot up. I have, again, auto hotkey, that meant software I mentioned before that controls the buttons, on and off buttons down here. I have that set up to automatically start my front end, which I'm using attract mode, which I will link to that as well, like I said, for my front end that controls it. So you can put other emulators and things into attract mode, but like I said, I am just using MAME because this is strictly an arcade machine for me. So it'll take a second. It might be a little loud, but you know, I've got my volume buttons down here. I could turn it down. Yeah, that was very loud. It took me a while to hunt around and find a intro video that I liked until I found this one. It's gonna say big box. I'm obviously not using big box. Like I said, I used attract mode, but I really liked this intro a lot, so I just went with this one. I just replaced the music in the beginning of it using an editing software because I like this song better. So I've got a nice little ambience going on that plays in the background that if you can hear that, it's the sound of just like an arcade. And then the game videos themselves all have little clips as well that have sound. But anyway, enough about that. So I've got this set up to a specific point where if you press both of these, it will ask if you want to shut down, and when you hit yes, it'll leave the software and shut down the computer, because that is a function of attract mode where you can have it leave the entire, you can have it have a shutdown command. So I'm going to stop again for a second here, and then we will kick back up in, and I will show the setup for kind of how I got attract mode going, and then I will explain kind of how MAME Roms work. Okay, so I've turned this all the way down so we don't have to hear all that going on in the background while we're messing around with it. But this is the configuration menu for attract mode. You get into it by hitting tab once you get in here. If you're booting attract mode for the first time, it's going to automatically take you to this emulators portion and have you try and add your first one. I added one called Arcade. You'll want to point at the executable, the working directory, which is just going to be the pretty much the same directory as the executable. That's just pointing at the executable directly. This points at the folder where it's at. Prog directory there points at the directory that attract mode itself is in. So I have it inside the attract mode folder, inside emulators, inside MAME. Same for the ROMs. The ROM types should be fine automatically. System identifier, you can name it whatever you want. I called it Arcade. I didn't have to do anything with any of this stuff. Exit hotkey, that's what I set to press those two buttons to be able to exit the emulator, or the front end. But it will also I set it to the same buttons for leaving the emulator itself. So if I'm in the middle of any game, I can hit that and it'll take me right back to the choosing menu. I have a pause hotkey, which I didn't really set because I have pause set in MAME itself. I found that it works better. Now the art, it's a little tricky to get all the art. You can see that I've got like background art and the video snaps and the marquee art for all the games and stuff. I used MU Movies. If you get a free account, and like me, I only have about 200-300 games, and so you can get most of that art in 1 day's worth of free downloads, because you can only download 250 megabytes a day. You just point it at your MAME directory with your ROMs in it and tell it to go, and it will automatically download most of that stuff for you. But I kind of had to source out some of that on my own with Progredo snaps and some other things. Especially for the video ones, I had to download all of those ones individually, because unless you pay for MU Movies, it won't download those for you. But if you want to pay the one-time fee to do that, then, you know, more power to you. That's your choice. So you point all these to the particular place where you're storing them, and it will automatically use them in this theme for the front end. I should mention that the theme for the front end that I'm using is called Nevato. If we go to Displays and Arcade, you'll see that's the name of the layout. So that's what makes it look like this. By default, I'll show you really quick. The default layout is called like Arcade Boy or something. Trackman, there you go. And it just kind of looks like Pac-Man around the edges, got the marquee up there, the thing plays there, and then just a basic list over there. I like having the wheel art, and I prefer having it with like the little arcade looking environment, which is why I went and downloaded Nevato. That's a free theme and it's super good. Very easy to use. I can switch back and forth with them real easy like that. So, that intro video, that's what I put in here. I gave it a name, Arcade Loud, because I've got one with a quieter default volume on it, just called Arcade. And that's what plays in the beginning there. And the ambience and stuff does start right away, even in the background, but the video is loud enough that you can't really hear it in the background of it. There is a scraper, which is a thing that downloads art for you, that is built into attract mode, but I didn't really have a lot of good luck with it. It would seem to download a chunk of stuff and then it would crash attract mode. So like I said, I didn't have a lot of good luck with it, so I didn't mess with it too much. So I'm going to Alt F4 out of here, so we don't have to, if I exit normally, it will shut down the computer since I have that shutdown command in there. So now we're going to switch to just the mouse. So I slapped a little SSD in here so the whole thing would boot and go faster. But all I've got in here, so here is this attract mode thing. That is one of the scripts I have running with auto hotkey to let me control the or no, sorry, this is the one that boots the computer. So it looks like that. Run, points at the exe, and then it tells it to run it in max just in case, and then it exits. It's done. And then I've got the other one. It's in my start folder, so I'd have to, we'll pull over to it real quick. You can definitely copy paste this whole pathway. You can find it online fairly easy, but this is where you would go to add software or items to the startup menu of your computer, so that it automatically starts when your computer does. There it is, startup. So here's the whole crazy path. App data, roaming, your profile name, app data, roaming, Microsoft, Windows, start menu, program, startup. So I've got in here that attract mode thing that starts it, and then volume control. So I'll show you what volume control looks like real quick. That just sets Joy 2, because I have both, or 2 Joy, that I have both of those buttons plugged into the second player USB controller in there, but I just have them plugged into the last 2 buttons, which is why 11 and 12 is right after Joy 2, or 2 Joy, and then sound set, and -5 and +5. So it just adds 5 or -5 from the volume. So super easy, runs automatically when the computer starts, and then stays down here running continuously. So let's go over MAME now. Let's kick back to disk into attract mode. We'll go into the emulator folder, go into MAME. So this is basically just MAME straight out, if you've got that. So I have all my ROMs in the ROMs folder. Oop, there they are. So there's going to be a lot more than 200 something files in here, because there's about 1,000 files actually, because I also have what are called BIOS and devices put in here. And that's one of the weird things about MAME. You're going to need BIOS and devices for a lot of games, or I wouldn't say a lot, but a decent amount of games require those files. Not worth going into the whole process of why they work and what they do, but in the end, what you'll need with MAME, there are 3 different types of MAME files you can get. There are merged ROMs, which is what I have. There are non-merged ROMs, and there are split ROMs. So merged ROMs means, so think about it, when you think about it, there are many different versions of each arcade cabinet that are out there based on region and version. So how do you determine which one's the one you use? In the case of merged, the team that develops MAME has placed the one that is the most stable and known to work, and made that kind of like the parent, like the main ROM for that set. And when you have a merged set, there's one zip folder, and it has all of the different versions in it and all the files required to run them, but there's no duplication of files. So if every single version needs this one file, you're not going to have it in there 6-7 times. It's going to be in there once, and it'll just access it depending on the version you're using. If you're running it right out of MAME, you can choose which version is like your favorite or whatever. In a front end, like a tracked mode, you're not going to get to choose your version. You'll have to separate the files piecemeal, which is what I did. Or there is non-merged. Non-merged is each game in its own zip file with exactly what it needs, including every version. So you can imagine there's a lot of duplication, which requires about double the space in terms of storage space for storing all of those games without having any problems. I didn't want to dig through that, and I had already honestly downloaded the merged set, so I did it this way, where I grabbed all the merged ones and then pulled specific ones if I needed another version, which was on very few games. Since this is 2-player, obviously, I did pull some 2-player versions instead of 4-player versions of games like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Simpsons, so you could choose which character you are, because in the 4-player version they assume you're going to stand in front of the controls for the player you want to be, and obviously we don't have that option. So that's non-merged and split, and non-merged and merged. Split is you get I hope I'm remembering this correctly. Split is you get zip files for each of the versions, but the parent one is still required to make all of the other ones work. So the size is very similar to merged. I honestly don't see the huge reason to do split, because if you delete that main one, none of the other ones are going to work, because the parent one has the main files, and then the zip files just have the required files for that version. So you can pull and delete the clone versions, the non-parent versions, but if you get rid of that parent one, it's going to F up all the other ones. So that's kind of the case in that instance. So granted, so if you get the right ROMs, and this is another thing to mention, version really does matter. Not in every case, but in a good number of cases, because every month they're releasing new versions of these ROMs. Not every ROM, obviously, that would be insane, but if they get a better dump of it or a more stable version running off of that dump, they will replace it in what is basically like the master of what is used by MAME. So if you can see right here, I have 0.211. If I had a version from like 1.188 or something, it might not necessarily work in version 0.211 of MAME, because if MAME expects a newer version and the files are different, it won't run. But if I have MAME 0.1811, then I will run it fine. And it might run other games fine if they haven't changed in that many versions, if that makes sense. So it's kind of important to either to know what version you're getting. If you're having a problem running a ROM, especially if you get, like, let's say a non-merged one, and you're like, why isn't it working? Everything should be inside of it. That could be the reason, if you have a different version. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of good places to source what version you're getting. So you kind of have to look around and hope that you luck out in that case, unless you find a place that has them all and you know you're getting what version. So there are places like that. Another thing to mention, if you have the version, the non-merged versions of files, that typically will include the BIOS and devices as well. You do not need to get them separately. And in my case, where I downloaded these ROMs from, even in the merged copy, it included all of the BIOS and devices. I just kind of copy pasted them out of it and grabbed all of them, because obviously those aren't games, so they won't show up in my game list. But in most cases, or depending on where you go, if you get the split or merged copies of a game, you may need to get BIOS and devices as well, or else games might not work. Certain games might not work. But if you have non-merged, they're going to be in there. But they might be in there unmerged and split. It just depends on where you get them. So the last kind of file type to mention, and this is going to be very specific to the game, are called CHDs. Now, CHDs are going to be required in any game that was so big that the game could not fit on the base chipset of the arcade cabinet. So this is going to be like newer games and 3D games and stuff. So Area 51, Gauntlet Dark Legacy, and Gauntlet Legends, a couple other games like that. Street Fighter Third Strike will require a CHD. So that is another case where it will say, you're missing this file, and the game won't run because you're missing the CHD. Now, I don't necessarily recommend, unless you want a full set, to download all the CHDs, because they are huge, and a lot of games that have CHDs aren't even compatible with MAME yet. They're not at a runnable, playable state. So I highly recommend picking and choosing which ones of those you need. I think I only have maybe 10 games that use CHDs, and everything else just runs. So as far as MAME goes, I think that's a good explanation. I hope it is, and as far as how ROMs work. Other than that, MAME's pretty straightforward in terms of how any other emulator is going to work. You're probably going to want to open up MAME outside of your front end just to set up some in-game controls and things, like your default buttons for things, and your default buttons for adding credits and exiting the emulator and pausing the emulator, saving states if you want to do that. I have it set to pressing these 3 saves and these 3 loads. If I have a game, I don't always have time to play an entire game, so I might want to save it and then come back later. So I set that up as well. Hopefully this has been a pretty good tutorial all around. I'm sorry if I kind of jumped around a bit, especially in the hardware portion. This is the first time I've done a tutorial kind of like this. I am completely open to any questions. If anybody has any, please comment and let me know, and I will 100% respond to any questions anybody has, except where do you get your ROMs, because I'm not going to tell you. But otherwise, I'll let you know. I should have links to everything required hardware-wise in the description. And hey, thanks for watching. I hope this helped you.